Assalamu alaikum. So this is my video response to the course review for MCOM 310. I have to establish a timeline in which we encapsulate the whole course, and we'll go through them step by step and section by section. So we'll start off with the introduction to the concept of models. Models were developed in order to understand communication better. It was a start. It was a start of research into the field of media and information. Now there are some pros and cons to models because models are built on hypotheses that are based on generalizations. So whenever you take generalizations, there are certain cons to that argument as well, and that's why all of the models that will be there's some of 20 something models that are discussed in this course, they're all subject to criticisms, and they all have criticism and they all have weaknesses because they are based on generalizations. So models are developed to give communication a sense of organization, the communication research a sense of organization, heuristic approach to it, and it enables us to predict certain outcomes of that communication of which that model is based on. But as we discussed before, because of these very cons, these very pros, there are certain cons as well, because they are based on generalization. They can mislead the researchers, and they're inherently incomplete. Early communication research started after the Second World War. Like all great things in life, the human beings woke up after one of the greatest tragedies to humankind, and they started researching on media effects, but they were more focused on the direct effects of media on their audiences, because that was the sort of vibe of that era. So one of the earliest models that were developed in the 1950s, the research started in the 1950s. So one of the earliest models were the sender channel receiver model, and it was quite simple. The sender sends a message through a channel, and the receiver receives it, and that's it. It was very straightforward. It was very linear, and it was not complicated at all. The 60s and 70s and the years followed focused more on the indirect effect of media on their audiences, which takes us to the second section of this course, which is the section of basic models. There are three main models that we discussed in this course in length. These are the Lasswell model, the Shannon-Weaver model, Osgood and Schramm model, and then there are other certain models, and the most important of which in them is the consonance and dissonance model. We'll go through them one by one. The Lasswell model is a propaganda model, because it was developed in 1948, and it was developed for the purpose of a direct effect. A convenient way to summarize that model is who says what in which channel to whom and with what effect. So it was about the direct effect of it, right? As we discussed before in the 1950s and during and before that, because of the very nature of that time, the outcomes were very straightforward. So that's the Lasswell model. It's also called the propaganda model. And even now, if you want a direct message without any feedback from your audience, that's the best approach. The second model is the Shannon-Weaver model, which was developed in 1949. Shannon-Weaver worked in a telephone company, and their approach was focused towards finding the source of noise in a telephonic conversation. Their research enabled DeFleur in 1970 to elaborate on the model, and he associated what DeFleur did was he associated noise with affecting the meaning of with noise with affecting with factors that affect the meaning of the communication, and he added the concept of feedback in it. And one of the most important points he pointed out was that correspondence of meaning is needed at both ends of the communication. So both ends of the communication, the sender and receiver need to perceive the same meaning that the message is giving out. The third model, the third most important model is in the basic models chapter is the Osgood and Schramm model. It was developed in 1954. The best part of about this is this was the start of the stepping back from the linear models. This was a cyclical model, and it depicted communication in its truest essence, in the sense that while in the other models, in the previous models, there is a starting and an ending to in communication. This model for the first time stepped back from that, and it gave us a picture of communication that was very true, which is that communication is never ending. The receiver the receiver goes on to become a sender, because whatever information is received by the receiver, he will go on to talk about that, and then he will become the sender. So that was the best part, and the Osgood and Schramm were regarded as one of the first who stepped away from the medium is the message model. One of the most important models in this is the concept of consonance and dissonance. The consonance and dissonance is described as this effect that people have that when exposed to certain communication, people will either distance themselves from it or assimilate to it. So when they distance themselves from the news, it's called dissonance, and when they assimilate themselves to the news, it's called consonance. So this is a model that gives us a very important insight into how people interacted with media. This is of course all primitive models, right? So now we'll go on to the third third section of this course, which is the section of personal influence and diffusion. This section deals with the relationship between media and individuals, and we have to start with how information is spread through society. The spread is defined as is described as diffusion. So the spread of information or the diffusion of information happens in two graphical patterns: the S curve and the J curve. Both of these patterns have their own significant features and their own certain type of content that that they signify and that they report on. So the first type is the S curve. The S curve is it covers type 2 events. These are the type 2 events, or the type of events that are reported on the mainstream media. What happens in the S curve is that whenever there is a story covered in the mainstream media, at first it has very low engagement. But if the story is big enough, it will whiplash into a great storm. So it will follow the shape of an S. In the J curve, it's highlighted by type 3 events. Type 3 events are the sort of event that have a big dramatic value and have a big emotional punch, sort of, and but there is a certain level of uncertainty regarding it. These are also very mainstream events, but these are events that are more tragic in nature. For example, the J curve was discovered during the time after Kennedy's assassination, because there was so much misconception when Kennedy was murdered or assassinated. So they did a study on how the audiences reacted to the news of Kennedy's assassination, and this was the pattern that emerged. Then after this, we have to move on towards understanding how that information is perceived. We first understood how the information spreads through the society. Now we have to understand how information is perceived. The perception of information is described through two models: the transmission and reception model. They provide a powerful insight towards how the content should be created to ensure maximum public comprehension. The transmission models deals with how different variables like high score in news value, that like for example the news has a high relatability value, or high it's near you, you're more likely to be affected by the news if it's that, and the perceived status of the media organization, how authentic you think that the media organization is, and the audience having a news habit, and how all these different variables deal with each other in shaping the comprehension of that news or the information in individuals or society, and how playing with these variables can positively and negatively affect the rate of comprehension of information. The reception model, on the other hand, deals with the importance of schematic frameworks in information processing and in information processing and recall, and how schemas, which are basically cognitive patterns, personal cognitive patterns, play a part in making an emotional impact on the audience by making them relate to the information. So because that information that you've just received, you can relate to it, it creates an emotional impact and incites a stronger perhaps action. The last part of this section deals with the influence of information media and audiences, the influence that information media and audiences have on each other. These can be categorized into two parts. The first group is those who deals with information influences in individuals, and the second part is the psychological and innovation diffusion models. And the second part is those who deal with how social interactions play into the and affect each other in terms of media and individuals. In the first group, there are two kinds of models: the stimulus response model, which you have discovered in the basic models, and the psychological and innovation diffusion model. The psychological model was developed by Comstock in 1978. This model is focused on the prevention of undesirable effects in the audiences through your news reporting, and it gives because it aims to prevent that. It gives a in-depth insight into the audience persona. Actions are only incited that when the content can establish a psychological significance of that action in that audience. That's the assumption that this model is based on. And it also details different variables like the perception of reality of content, consequences of recreation of action, as well as the possibility of being able to recreate that action that can alter the motivation or arousal in that individual. The third model shows us how individuals behave to exposure to new information. This was developed in 1973 by Rogers and Schumacher. This model also includes the social interaction in the form of cultural and societal norms as variables, but it is mostly dependent on behaviors driven by personal decisions, cognitive patterns, and attitudes. According to this model, human beings seem to follow a pattern when exposed to new information. In that they seek reinforcements of or on whatever side that appeases their cognitive patterns. So whatever biases you have, you will seek information in a way that reinstates that or reinforces that. The second group of models that deal with societal interactions and how it affects media and audiences is the first model, and this is the two-step model by Katz and Lazarsfeld. It was developed in 1944, right after the 1940s U.S. presidential elections. This study found out that when information is presented by a person that you can relate to and hold in high regard, you will perceive information better. This is theory that perhaps gave rise to the modern influencers culture. The second model of this category is developed by Broer in 1967. It's called the mycelium model. It describes this model describes that how media information is not just a one-way street; it's a two-way street, and both of these influence each other. And this is an apt description of the social media culture of today, where audiences are analyzed actively to understand what kind of content that needs to be generated.